The first generation of Pokemon is often regarded as one of the best in the series, and while I'm not denying that, it's also important to consider the nostalgia factor in our assessment. The thing with Gen 1 is, everyone is nostalgic over it. From those who experienced the original trilogy of games in the late 90s, to people like myself who played through Fire Red and Leaf Green growing up, all the way to the kids who first experienced Gen 1 with Pokemon Let's Go. This generation of Pokemon was seemingly present throughout all of our childhoods. The main difference between then and now is that we have a lot more games to base our opinions on. When Red and Blue came out way back in 1998, that was the world's first taste of Pokemon, and judging by how fast an anime, a trading card game, and a sequel was adapted, it was obviously a lucrative franchise as well. Up to this point, gaming was quite an offline experience. Online multiplayer was barely established on computers, and consoles had tried and failed at making it work. So the most popular way to play was with friends locally. Pokemon had appealed to this demographic of gamers with features like trading and battling locally, giving both a sense of competition and camaraderie among friends who played these games. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I was there for it though, because I was born in 2004. This was the year that Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green came out. Of course though, I didn't play games until I was a bit older, let's say 3 or 4 years old. Moreover, I didn't even play Pokemon games until I was about 6, when Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver came out. These were my first Pokemon games, but surprisingly not my first experience with Kanto. See, I never actually got to that second half of the game when you go through the Kanto region, since I was too busy losing to the Elite Four. In reality, my first experience with Gen 1 ended up being Fire Red after all, 7 years after it came out. I didn't own a GBA or anything, and I didn't even play it on my DS either. The first time I played Fire Red was with an emulator on my Android phone. Let me tell you though, this game was amazing to me. It was slightly easier than Johto in my opinion, and it just felt a lot more pure in how you went through it. It gave you just enough freedom to feel like you were choosing how to play the game, but also enough guidance that you didn't get lost too often. At the time, I wasn't too invested in the online parts of the games. In fact, I was always a little confused what that upstairs area of the Pokemon Center was. Regardless, I appreciated this game for its value as a single player experience and replayed it countless times. My experience with the Gen 1 perhaps wasn't viewed as favorably as Gen 2, but that's just because Heart Gold was so incredibly fun for me. I haven't forgot about Pokemon Red and Blue though. Despite how admittedly obsolete these games have become, I have played a little bit of them before, on my calculator. Right now you're seeing my hands play the first Pokemon games on the calculator I bought for my high school calc classes. Now I'm not exactly sure of the difference between the Game Boy Color and this, but I have to say this game was pretty fun to play on it. It was also quite surreal swapping between a video game and calculus graphs in the middle of class, but hey, I was bored. The game itself was alright. Like if it was my first Pokemon game and I was around in the late 90s, I would have definitely loved it. It's just a little hard to take the game seriously when the sprites look like this, and so many quality of life changes made in future games just aren't there. Also, there wasn't any sound that could be played from my calculator, so it was just a pretty barren experience besides when I needed to kill some time in class. Not to mention, I was actually playing a much better version of this generation in class, which was Fire Red. In my senior calc class, I often sat next to my friend, who I'll just call Jonathan. He and I just so happened to be both interested in Pokemon, so I figured why not open my laptop and emulate some Fire Red. Eventually, this became a frequent habit, since our teacher was perhaps the most boring one I've ever had. This playthrough of the game was one of my favorite and most memorable runs I've done because we both kinda had a say in the team I built. If I remember correctly, my team was Charizard, Snorlax, Gyarados, Jolteon, Pidgeot, and I think Dragonite. So yeah, pretty broken. Like we even forgot that I had beat the game because I just ran through the entire Elite Four like it was nothing. Unfortunately, I lost the save, so I can't show you the exact file I played on, but this is certainly one of the fondest memories I have with this generation. The last remake of Gen 1 I should mention today is Pokemon Let's Go. I think this game was pretty divisive when it came out. I know a lot of people were upset with how childish this game felt, and yeah, that was kind of an issue if you were a big fan of the challenge in previous generations. And I definitely agree that the games were a little too easy and would have been better if you could choose different difficulties. Besides that though, I was actually a huge fan of these games. Let me preface that my favorite Pokemon games are Black and White, so I definitely went into Let's Go with a pessimistic attitude. When I actually went through the whole game though, I had a great time. The music was redone beautifully, the visuals were pretty solid, and the ease of catching Pokemon made it a great game to complete the Pokédex. Basically, it wasn't trying too hard to be something it wasn't. wasn't, and it didn't change the formula of the series like Sun and Moon did. This was just a solid Pokemon experience. Not sure if I'm already getting flamed in the comments, but I think technically speaking the only Gen 1 games are just Red, Blue, and Yellow. Technically this video should be considered my opinions on different versions of Kanto, but I don't really care that much about the technicalities, I just like the games. Anyway, throughout this video I've been praising Kanto a lot and telling a bunch of my personal stories, but I want to make sure I also touch on the problems with this region. First of all, my least favorite part of these games are always the beginning parts. I really do not like the grindy aspects of the first two cities, especially since I choose Charmander every time. That's actually something that I also dislike about these games. Bulbasaur is clearly the best starter for most of the game, with a few exceptions. And by the point where grass types begin to struggle, you already have built a team to handle type disadvantages. Going into Misty with a Charmeleon is something that usually always causes me to lose a few times. Red and Blue really struggled with this from my experience, but this problem is fortunately not as bad in the remakes. Something that wasn't so great in the remakes though was the Sevia Islands. When I discovered that there were islands in the Kanto region just like the anime, I was super excited. However, I was swiftly disappointed when I actually played through them. Honestly, there isn't much to talk about here, and they're pretty much just used to house a couple Johto Pokemon. Another issue I have is the fact that this region tries to make it seem larger than it actually is. When you're playing through the game, you're sure to encounter this thirsty guard who will prevent you from progressing to Saffron City. This adds an incredible amount of distance for you to travel for seemingly no reason. As a kid, I remember spending way too much time trying to figure out how to get past this guard, and for that, I really hate this section of the game. Also, I really should mention how boring a lot of this region is. If this game came out in the modern day and we had no prior nostalgia of it, I don't believe people would find it that enjoyable. It just seems like all the routes are just basic grassy areas or annoying caves, and since there weren't that many Pokemon in these, you would often find yourself running into the same ones over and over again, which is something that is fortunately not a problem anymore. On a brighter note, Kanto had a lot of cool moments that definitely made up for the more annoying parts. First of all, the SS Anne was always when things started getting interesting for me. Of course, the fights with the trainers and your rival were cool, but the fact that you finally got the HM you needed to cut down those trees you've been seeing around the region was quite satisfying when I first played through the game. Another cool place was the game corner, and while I thought it was pretty fun by itself, when I saw that Team Rocket's hideout was hidden inside of it, I personally thought that was super cool. The Safari Zone was another place that I'm sure many others spent a lot of time in. It was really a great change of pace from the main adventure, and it also was where I caught a Dratini to put on my final team. With all that being said, my assessment of Kanto comes with mixed feelings. It certainly isn't my favorite region, but that doesn't really mean I dislike anything that much about it. With some games like Pokemon Sun and Moon, I don't think I could ever really replay them, and even if I did, I certainly wouldn't enjoy it. Technically speaking, Sun and Moon are far better than the Gen 1 games in almost all aspects, but those improvements cannot make up for the vibe that Kanto brings. Sure, it's basic and doesn't really have any unique gimmicks to it like all the other regions, but sometimes that's exactly what I'm looking for in a Pokemon game. Recent games in the series have put a lot of focus on certain mechanics like Gigantamaxing and Terastallizing, and honestly, I'm not the biggest fan of it. I really liked Mega Evolution, but I think that these transformations are getting a bit too uninspired at this point. However, if you were to ask me if I want another game related to Kanto, I would probably say no. This region has been remade like 3 times at this point, and I think there's nothing really left to do here. Going forward, I want to see regions of the past get the treatment that Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire gave Gen 3. No remake is going to be perfect for everyone, but these captured the feelings of Hoenn and allowed a new generation of gamers to experience it for the first time. For Kanto though, I think it's perfectly fine to let the region rest for now. After the incredibly lazy remakes of Gen 4, I don't want any more games of the past being scrapped together and sold for $60. I hope the Pokemon Company looks back at the reception of Fire Red and Leaf Green, along with Heart Gold and Soul Silver, and finally starts to understand what fans have truly been missing in these recent games.